The rain tapped gently against the clinic windows like a slow, mournful drum. Outside, the clouds hung low over the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in thick shades of gray. Inside room 3 of Willowbend Veterinary Clinic, the world had gone still, save for the shallow breathing of the German Shepherd lying silently by the door. Thatcher Vance, or Bob, as his late owner used to call him, hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. His ears twitched at every sound, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty space where his owner had last stood. There was something in his stare, a sadness that went beyond comprehension. It wasn't just grief, it was knowing. Dr. Elias Thornwell, in his early 40s and worn down by years of quiet losses, pushed open the exam room door and paused in the doorway. The dog didn't look up. He didn't need to. Somehow he knew who was there. Elias stepped inside slowly, stethoscope still around his neck, and lowered himself to the floor with a soft grunt. He looked at the animal, at the empty leash still clipped to the frayed collar, and felt the kind of tightness in his chest that couldn't be explained by medicine. "He's really gone, huh?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Bob didn't respond. He didn't need to. Just that morning, Elias had received a call from the sheriff. Gideon Wexley, war veteran, reclusive soul, and one of the town's most enigmatic figures, had been found dead in his armchair. Cardiac arrest. Bob had been by his side the whole time, unmoving, protective until the last breath. It took 2 deputies to get him to let go. Now he was here, silent and grieving. Elias reached forward, running his fingers gently along the thick fur of Bob's neck. His hand paused at the collar, old leather cracked at the edges. Something caught his attention. A loose seam. He leaned in. "What's this?" He tugged carefully at the edge of the leather where the stitching had come undone. Something crinkled beneath it. Elias's fingers pulled free a folded piece of yellowing paper, hidden deep within the collar's lining. The dog shifted ever so slightly but didn't resist. The paper was thin, delicate from age and sweat. Elias unfolded it with care. His eyes scanned the page, and his entire face changed. Pale, jaw tight, his breath caught halfway in his chest. "My God!" Bob gave a low, guttural whimper. Elias stood slowly, still holding the paper. He turned to the table behind him and set it down under the light, eyes fixed on the familiar but shaking handwriting. It was Gideon's, a letter, dated over 20 years ago. Elias read it once, then again. Each sentence hit like a blow to the ribs. The words weren't just about a man's final wishes or a lost friend. They were a confession, a secret buried under decades of silence and guilt. And suddenly, everything made sense. Gideon's isolated life, his distrust of people, the way he'd always watched Elias a little too long, as if wanting to say something but never could. There was a name in the letter. Rowan Merrick. Elias knew that name. Everyone in town did. And then came another. Mera Calhoun. Elias staggered back a step. He hadn't heard that name in years. His mother had spoken of her once, only once, and then refused to ever speak of it again. He looked back at Bob, who still hadn't moved. "You were guarding more than your master, weren't you?" The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping faster against the window panes. Inside, the air had grown thick with grief, yes, but also with something else. Truth. Elias picked up the letter again. There was more, much more, than he could process in one sitting. But one thing was already clear. The dog hadn't just lost his owner. He had delivered a message meant to shake everything Elias thought he knew about his town, his past, and maybe even himself. And this was only the beginning. Dr. Elias Thornwell couldn't sleep that night. The letter, still spread across his kitchen table, stared at him like a ghost resurrected from the past. His fingers kept tracing the ink, reading the same lines over and over again, hoping they'd somehow mean something different the next time. But they didn't. The words were permanent. And Mera Calhoun's name was there, in Gideon Wexley's trembling hand, not once but 3 times. He hadn't heard that name in over 20 years. Not since he was 16, standing in his mother's kitchen when she'd gotten that phone call. His mother, Margaret, had gone pale, slammed the phone down and whispered, "No one ever speaks her name again." That was all she said. and Elias had listened. Until now, what haunted Elias more than the mention of Mera was the final line in the letter. It read, "I never told him the truth. If anyone deserves to know, it's Elias." The weight of that sentence sat on his chest like a stone. What truth? What had Gideon been hiding from him all these years? He'd known the man most of his adult life, treated Bob for nearly a decade, and not once did Gideon ever hint at anything more than casual friendship. And now, after death, he drops a bomb that makes Elias question everything. Unable to ignore the ache in his chest, Elias made a decision. At dawn, he returned to the clinic to check on Bob. The old shepherd hadn't moved from the kennel. His eyes were alert but weary, as if he too had spent the night remembering. Elias sat on the floor next to the kennel and whispered, "You knew her, didn't you? Mera. You remember the name." Bob's ears perked slightly, just enough. A knock on the back door startled them both. Elias stood and opened it to find Sable Meyerwood, his sharp-eyed veterinary assistant, bundled in her coat with a coffee in hand. "You look like hell," she said, handing him the cup. Elias took a sip and nodded. "I need your help with something. Not medical." Sable raised an eyebrow. "Sounds interesting already." Elias glanced back at Bob, then at the letter folded in his pocket. "I think there's more to that dog than we ever knew, and it starts with a woman named Mera Calhoun." Elias sat at the clinic's small break room table with Sable Meyerwood, the letter carefully flattened between them. She read it silently, her brows drawing together as she reached the final lines. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely above a whisper. This isn't just a goodbye letter. This is a confession." Elias nodded slowly. "Gideon wanted me to find this. He wanted Bob to lead me to it." He glanced out the door toward the kennel. Bob was lying in the corner, his head resting on his front paws, one eye watching them through the bars. He didn't just leave behind a dog. He left behind a trail. Sable leaned back in her chair. "So who is Mera Calhoun?" she asked. "Why did your mom never want her name spoken?" Elias hesitated, a heaviness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "All I know is that Mera was someone my mother once knew. Deeply. She came to town when I was just a kid. She was different, kind, quiet. People said she was running from something, but no one ever asked questions. Then one day she was just gone. My mother never talked about it again." Sable tilted her head. "Do you think she's still alive?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But if she is, she's the only person who might help me understand what Gideon was trying to say, and why he said I deserve the truth." He paused, then added, "We need to find her." The search began that evening. Sable pulled up Old Town records on her laptop while Elias scanned through boxes in the clinic's attic, receipts, pet adoption forms, and old emergency contacts. Hours passed before Sable suddenly froze. "Elias," she called out, her voice sharp. He came over quickly. On the screen was a scanned document from 1994, an emergency contact form filled out by Gideon Wexley. The name listed next to "in case of emergency" wasn't a family member or neighbor. It was Mera Calhoun, and next to it, an address, one Elias hadn't seen in decades. It wasn't even in the same town. The road to Stillwater Creek hadn't changed much since Elias was a boy. It curved through the thick woods like a vein carved into the heart of Tennessee. As he drove, the morning fog clung to the trees, casting long shadows that moved slowly across the pavement. In the passenger seat, Sable kept her eyes on the GPS, though both of them knew this was more than just a trip to an address. This was a journey into a past long buried. Elias gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I remember coming out here once with my mom," he said quietly. "I was maybe 10. We dropped off a package. She made me wait in the car. I never saw who she was talking to, but when she came back, she was crying." His voice faltered. "That was the only time I saw her cry." Sable glanced at him, her expression softening. "Do you think Mera and your mom had history?" "I think they had more than that," Elias replied. "I think they had secrets, and I think Gideon knew all of them." The car slowed as they reached the end of a gravel path. Nestled among tall pines, barely visible behind overgrown bushes, stood a small wooden cabin with a tin roof. The porch sagged, and the paint had peeled into gray patches, but there was life. A thin stream of smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was home. Elias stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. Sable followed close behind. The air was thick with damp earth and pine resin, and the only sound was the wind rustling the trees. He knocked gently on the door. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of slow footsteps from inside. The door creaked open. A woman appeared, her silver hair pulled into a low bun, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her face was older now, weathered by time, but Elias recognized her instantly. Mera Calhoun. She stared at him for a long moment, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. "You're Margaret's boy," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Elias nodded. "My name's Elias Thornwell. I think you knew my mother, and I know you knew Gideon Wexley." Myra's eyes darkened. She stepped aside slowly, gesturing for them to enter. "If you've come all this way, then I suppose it's finally time," she said. "There's something you need to know." The cabin smelled like cedarwood and old paper. Time seemed to hang in the air, thick and unmoving, as Mera Calhoun poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat across from Elias at the weathered kitchen table. Sable stood quietly near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the landscape like a sentinel. Outside, the trees whispered in the wind, but inside the silence felt heavier than stone. Mera didn't speak right away. She studied Elias's face, the way his hands clenched around the mug, the flicker of confusion and urgency in his eyes. "You look so much like her," she said softly. "Your mother had the same look when she didn't know whether to run or fight." Elias leaned forward, the paper from Gideon's collar now resting on the table between them. "Why did he write that I deserve the truth? What truth? Why hide it in a dog's collar?" Mera took a deep breath and looked down. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup like she was circling something buried deep inside. "Because Gideon was afraid," she said. "Afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Not for himself, but for you." She paused, then added, "You were never supposed to find out." Elias blinked. "Find out what?" She raised her eyes to his, and in them was a storm she had carried for decades. "Gideon Wexley was your father, Elias." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. His breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't even move. A ringing filled his ears. "What?" Mera nodded slowly, the lines in her face deepening with regret. "Your mother and Gideon met during the fall of 1981. He had just come back from deployment. Broken. Guilty. She was working at the VA hospital. They connected. But Margaret was terrified of what being with a man like Gideon would mean for you. His past. His silence. She made a choice to raise you on her own to protect you. He respected that. But he never stopped watching over you from a distance." Elias stared at the table, unable to speak. The air felt thin in his lungs. All his life, he believed he was the son of a woman who had simply chosen to be alone. Strong, determined, unwilling to look back. But now, with Myra's confession ringing in his ears, that belief shattered. Gideon Wexley, the man he'd known only as a distant client, a quiet veteran with tired eyes, had been silently walking through the edges of his life as a father. Mera didn't press him to respond. She let the silence fill the room naturally, as if understanding that grief wasn't limited to the dead. Sometimes, it clung to truths that arrived too late. "He visited the clinic more than he needed to," she said gently. "He brought that dog in for checkups even when Bob didn't need them. He just wanted to see you. But he was too broken to say anything." Elias stood and walked to the window, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. Outside, the forest swayed in slow, mournful movements. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "He looked me in the eyes, for years, and never said a word." "He didn't think he deserved to," Mera replied. "You have to understand, after the war, Gideon was never the same. He lost men, made mistakes, He pushed everyone away, including your mother. But he always watched from a distance. Margaret didn't forgive him, but she knew he loved you in his own silent, tortured way. Elias turned to face her. Why didn't my mother tell me? Why erase him from my life? Mera sighed deeply. Because she saw what he became after the war. She didn't want that shadow to pass to you. She was trying to give you a life free of it. Clean. But secrets, Elias, they always find their way out eventually. Even if it takes a dog to carry them. Sable finally spoke from the corner of the room. The letter, the collar, Bob knew. He carried it for years. He was guarding that truth. Her voice cracked slightly. That dog was protecting more than his owner. He was protecting a family. Elias sat back down, his hands trembling. His thoughts were scattered, memories of Gideon's quiet nods at the clinic. The rare moments he lingered just a bit too long. The strange sense of familiarity Elias could never explain. Now it all made sense. The truth had always been near, just out of reach. And now that he had it, it felt like both a gift and a wound. The porch steps creaked under Elias's boots as he approached his childhood home. The sky above Knoxville was heavy with low-hanging clouds, the kind that threatened rain but held back just enough to build tension. Elias hadn't called ahead. He didn't want to. Some truths had to arrive unannounced. Margaret Thornwell answered the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, but her eyes, always sharp, narrowed at the sight of him. "You've been somewhere," she said flatly. "I found Mera," Elias replied. He didn't smile, didn't step inside. Margaret didn't ask how. She simply moved aside and let him in. The house smelled like lemon polish and memory, the same scent it always had. The furniture was untouched. The photographs still hung in perfect symmetry on the hallway wall. It was a house where control lived. But today, Elias had none. They sat across from each other in the living room, an old clock ticking like a metronome between them. "You should have told me," Elias said after a long pause. "About Gideon, about everything." His mother closed her eyes, just for a second. "I did what I had to. You don't understand what kind of man he was." "No," Elias replied. "You don't understand the man he became. He was broken, yes, but he loved me, in his own way, and you knew it." Margaret's voice remained calm, but her hands tightened around her teacup. "Your father came back from war with demons that no one could name. He wouldn't let anyone near him, except me. And even that was temporary. I made the choice to keep you safe." "You made that choice for you, not for me," Elias snapped, louder than he meant to. "You erased him. Let me grow up believing he didn't exist." For the first time, her voice cracked. "Because I was afraid. Not of him, but of what knowing him would do to you. I didn't want you to carry his guilt." Elias leaned back, his eyes burning. "Then why did he watch me grow up from a distance? Why did he come to the clinic just to see me? He left a letter hidden in Bob's collar. And in it, he said I deserved the truth." Margaret looked away toward the window. Her lips pressed tightly together, holding back something. Maybe anger, maybe sorrow, maybe both. Finally, she whispered, "I knew one day this would happen, that the truth would find you." Elias stood slowly. "It already has. And now I have to figure out what to do with it." Elias returned to Gideon's house 2 days later. The police had already cleared the scene, and the property had been released to the county. No next of kin on record. The place was quiet, just as Gideon had lived. Still, sparse, and heavy with unsaid things. Bob padded beside him slowly, his paws silent on the wooden floor. The dog had refused to eat for over a day, but now that he was back, something in his posture shifted. Calmer, more alert, as if he'd come home. Elias moved room by room, not as a trespasser, but as a son trying to understand the life of a father he never really knew. There were no pictures on the walls, no trophies, no certificates, just books, dozens of them worn, annotated, underlined. Philosophy, war, history, veterinary science. Elias paused at a shelf where one book stood out, On the Origin of Species. Inside the cover, Gideon had scribbled a single sentence, "We all evolve, or we die with the past. He sat down on the old couch and Bob climbed up beside him, something he never used to do. The dog rested his head on Elias's lap, exhaling deeply. "You stayed," Elias said softly, stroking behind the dog's ears. "Even when he couldn't give you love the way you deserved. You never left him." It wasn't just loyalty, Elias realized. Bob had sensed the truth long before any human had. He had carried Gideon's scent, his grief, and his final message like a living bridge between two generations. Bob had never been just a pet. He had been a witness, a keeper of history, a silent soul bound to two broken men trying to find their place in the world. Elias looked down at the dog. "You're not just his. You're mine now." The words came out before he could think. And they felt right. For the first time since the letter, he felt like he had direction. Not answers, not closure, but something he could move toward. Gideon had failed as a father in life, but in death, he had left behind one last act of love. This dog. This companion. This guardian. That night, Elias took Bob home. He didn't go back to the clinic. Not yet. He needed time to think, time to grieve, time to finally sit with the truth instead of running from it. And as Bob lay curled at the foot of his bed, eyes open in the dark, Elias whispered, "You remembered for both of yous, didn't you?" And for the first time in days, Bob wagged his tail. The autumn air had turned crisp by the time Elias stepped back into Willow Bend Veterinary Clinic. It had been almost a week since he'd returned with Bob, and the silence of that time had done more to heal him than any conversation possibly could. He wasn't the same man who had walked out with questions. Now he had something else. Purpose. Sable was in the lobby when he arrived, reorganizing patient files. She looked up, surprised, then smiled softly when she saw Bob trotting in at Elias's side. "You came back," she said. "Yeah," Elias replied. "I think it's time." Sable set the files down and approached them. Bob pressed his head gently against her leg. Not with sadness, but with comfort. "He's different now," she said, kneeling down to meet the dog's eyes. "So am I," Elias murmured. He walked past the reception counter, toward the small office in the back. Gideon's letter still folded in his coat pocket. On the desk, he placed a framed photo. One of him, Bob, and the old Wexley cabin in the background. A recent photo taken the day before. He stared at it for a long time. Later that afternoon, Elias made an announcement to the local press. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Just a short piece about honoring the life of a local veteran, Gideon Wexley, who had passed away and left behind a deeply loyal dog. He offered a tribute in his name. The Wexley Companion Fund, a donation-supported program to help cover veterinary care for aging dogs owned by veterans. "Every dog deserves a home. Every veteran deserves a companion," he said in the post. The response was overwhelming. Cards came in from across Tennessee. Veterans dropped off letters. Some brought dogs who, like Bob, had been their lifeline through lonely nights and silent memories. And Elias saw it all, the connection, the pain, the gratitude. For the first time, he understood what Gideon had been trying to build in silence. That night, as the clinic lights dimmed and the last client left, Elias sat in the kennel room beside Bob. The old shepherd rested his head on Elias's boot, calm and at peace. "You brought me here," Elias whispered, "to this moment, and I think maybe this was what he wanted all along. Not forgiveness, just..." The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of Elias's home, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. Bob lay at the edge of the rug, his breathing slow but steady. Age had caught up to him in small ways. A little more stiffness in his legs, longer naps, slower walks. But there was still light in his eyes and loyalty in every movement. Elias sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. The letter from Gideon now laminated and kept in a drawer nearby. Not hidden, not forgotten. He had read it so many times that the words no longer shocked him. Instead, they brought clarity, understanding, even peace. The kind of peace that only comes after a long, painful reckoning with truth. Margaret had come to visit the week before. Their conversation had been quiet, careful, but honest. She had apologized not just for what she hid, but for thinking she was protecting him by denying him the chance to choose. Elias hadn't forgiven everything, but he had listened, and for now that was enough. Sometimes healing didn't come in dramatic revelations. Sometimes it came in the quiet acceptance of what was. Outside, a small group gathered in front of the clinic. Today was the official dedication of the Wexley Companion Fund's new space, a modest wing attached to the main building. It would offer free care for senior dogs of veterans and grief counseling for those who lost both animal and human companions. Elias stood at the edge of the gathering, Bob at his side, listening as Sable read a short dedication speech. "He was a man of few words," she said, her voice steady. "But the ones he left behind changed lives. This fund isn't just about dogs. It's about second chances, about the silent bonds that never leave us, even when people do." As the small crowd clapped, Elias felt something shift inside him. Not sadness, not even pride, just a quiet awareness that somehow all of it, the silence, the secrets, the sorrow, had led to this. Something meaningful, something good. That night, back home, Elias opened the window and let the crisp autumn air fill the room. Bob was already curled up on the blanket near the foot of the bed. Elias sat down beside him and whispered, "You did good, old boy. You carried something no one else could. And because of you, I finally found where I belong." Bob didn't move. He didn't need to. His tail thumped once against the floor, soft but certain. And in that stillness, nothing else needed to be said.